Towards the end of May, Bill asked if she would consider joining him for a week's stay up at his mother's house on Martha's Vineyard. "I didn't go up at all last year," he said, "but if you're of a mind to, I'll make the trip with you." "I was thinking of the last week of July," he added. "How would that be?" "What's the place like?" she asked. "Oh, you'll like it," he responded. "It's got a great beach, and," he added, "the island's a beautiful place." "Oh, I love the ocean," she said. She remembered her short trip to Nantucket when she was 8, and a summer spent with Maureen in Provincetown a few years later. The thought of getting out of town with Bill for a whole week appealed to her greatly. She hadn't seen them since the dinner party some months back, except for one time when she had looked out of Bill's window and seen his mother walking the little terrier on the street below. Also, summer classes would be over by the middle of July. She was sure her family would not object, knowing that she was staying with his family and that they were very serious about each other. The dawn of their departure, the radio was predicting a wilting week of heat and giving cautionary advice to the ill and the aged. They quickly loaded up the back of Bill's '46 Chevy with suitcases, rackets, and cameras, and pulled away from the curb with a sense of release, aware of the pressing need to make the 2 o'clock ferry out of Woods Hole. With the grimy city outskirts behind them, they sailed up the Merritt Parkway with its shady green trees, grassy embankments, and the bridges she liked, one very different from the other. Past New Haven, the roads were less crowded, and when the traffic of the old-fashioned town slowed them down, she admired the old churches, stately granite banks, town squares, and further out, the deserted old mills, always near rivers that made her think of the immigrants who once worked there. She decided that she wanted to come back sometime to visit these places, to park and walk around a little. But of course, they couldn't stop now since they mustn't be late for the ferry. They reached Woods Hole as the ferry was approaching the slip, and Susan got out of the car to stretch while Bill ran to validate the ticket. A strong salt breeze was blowing off the water, and Susan could see the island stretched out on the far horizon, just across the sparkling Sound. The ride over seemed dreamlike. Above them, gulls swung in wide arcs, eyes trained on the bread that some of the passengers held out for them over their heads. Susan slipped into her sweatshirt, exhilarated by the coolness of the wind. They held hands as they leaned on the upper deck railings. The island was coming closer by the minute. Now her eyes fastened on a small lighthouse and low bluffs where mammoth shingled houses stood, built in a time when families were large and servants plentiful. They descended the car, waiting for the signal to exit from the ferry. Emerging into the day again, they saw a small town with clustered frame houses and white steeples gleaming in the sun. Not stopping, they headed up island, following a long road that led past old farms, stretches of woods and meadows. Wild grape bushes grew close to the side of the road, dappled with light. Gradually, the terrain became less wooded, more hilly, and there were views of the sea. At the top of a high hill, Bill slowed the car and pulled over for them to see the view. To their right was an old, peaceful cemetery, and to their left, a long hill dipped down to the ocean. It was perfectly still. Ahead of them, far in the distance, Bill pointed out 6 tall chimneys to be seen above the treetops. "That's the house," he said, and they climbed back into the car and sped on. About 2 miles further, Bill took a sharp turn to the left. The car dipped down into a half-hidden, shady dirt road. The road went straight, then turned right, running through a wide and sunny meadow. Beyond, in the distance on higher ground, stood the stately old house with its high brick chimneys. The car continued on, raising dust, passing a barn, proceeding up through deep woods to the top of a hill. Ahead lay the sprawling house. Bill slowed down, passed the back door of the house, and pulled up beside an old copper beech tree. He tapped his horn lightly, and they got out of the car. There was the muffled sound of the little shrill dog again, perhaps inside somewhere, and Betty came running around from behind a high hedge of rose hips which bordered the side of the house, her face registering alarm. "Shh! Shh!" she loudly whispered, one finger to her lips, the other hand holding pruning shears, pointing to an upstairs window. "Wally's upstairs. He's staying an extra day. He's had a bad headache since he woke up, and he's napping right now." She made motions for them to carry their things into the house and whispered that Bill's stepfather had gone canoeing for the afternoon, but would be back in time for dinner. They followed her past the hedge cuttings cast on the grass, up onto the front porch, and into the house. Betty headed for the staircase, and they tiptoed behind her upstairs, carrying their things. They walked by a closed door and were led into a small room just beyond. "You should be comfortable here," Betty whispered to Susan. "This is Lucretia's room. She's off island visiting friends." Bill had mentioned his younger sister, who was at college most of the time, to Susan. Turning quickly, Betty said, "And now, Bill, the other room down the hall is all yours." Now, by herself, Susan looked around the little room. It was really quite charming, with its small fireplace, sloping ceiling, its bookshelves, the narrow bed pushed up against a window. She leaned on the floral bedspread and looked out. Beyond the stately copper beech, she saw meadows, groves of trees, a saltwater pond in the distance. Bill poked his head in the doorway just then. "How about a swim?" he suggested. He was already in his suit, a long towel thrown over one shoulder. Handing her a towel for himself, he whispered, "I'll wait for you downstairs." She knelt, digging through her bag, and pulled out her bathing suit. Moments later, she was coming down the wide stairway, seeing Bill waiting for her at the open front door. The house was very quiet, and Betty was nowhere to be seen. They closed the door quickly behind them. There was a low growl by the porch steps, and Susan saw the little terrier, now at large, looking warily at her. She stood waiting and holding her ground, but it quickly lost interest, turning away to disappear around the other side of the house. They strolled across the wide front lawn, heading towards some low trees and shrubbery. "Who's Wally?" she asked, wondering about the guest sleeping upstairs. "Oh, he's a nice guy, a Yale law professor," Bill answered. "He's been around for years and comes up every summer. His specialty is constitutional law." They found themselves on a grassy path, flanked by lush bushes that were covered with wild grape leaves. A sweet scent of honeysuckle blew past them, and Susan thought she heard the muffled sound of breaking waves. The path suddenly opened up to a full view of the ocean from the top of towering bluffs. Susan couldn't believe her eyes. She felt on top of the world, looking to the left and the right. Before them, the ocean stretched out as far as the eye could see. Wide-eyed, she looked down, watching the waves breaking on the sandy beach. They walked quickly down a long flight of wooden stairs that were built to fit the contours of the cliffs. There was absolutely no other person to be seen on the beach. It was all theirs. It was like the dawn of time. Susan had been told that there had been a long tradition of nude bathing on this beach. Bill had explained that his mother had been much in favor of it. She thought it the natural thing to do, the way to get beyond the prevailing idea that the body is a sexual, lustful thing. Bill had gone on to say that the custom was different now, that there had been a change in her thinking when Lucretia turned 12. At that time, Betty and Alec had decided that she should be spared the sight of their nude beach guests. Bill and his brother Jay, now at an army base in Maryland, had been secretly relieved when the decision to wear bathing suits had come down. They had spent too many years retreating down the beach to get away from the nudity, afraid of the possibility of arousal. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, Susan and Bill turned to the right and walked some distance up the beach. They threw their towels and ran side by side to the edge of the water. Beyond them, tall waves crested, breaking on the flat, sandy beach. Susan had no fear of strong surf. A kind uncle taught her the way to handle it as a small child. You would run in as soon as a wave had broken, keep plowing on, and then as the next wave towered above, you'd dive under and through at the same time. She laughed giddily as she advanced now, daring the waves, glad to be back in the ocean once more. Out beyond the breaking waves now and treading water, she turned to look back at the orange and ochre cliffs shining in the late afternoon light. The beach remained empty still, with absolutely no one in sight. The thought crossed her mind that she wanted to swim naked, to feel herself in total contact with the cold and salty water. "Let's take our suits off," she shouted to Bill. But he couldn't hear her because he'd just come up from a deep water plunge. She swam close to him, throwing her arms around his neck, and repeated the idea. A flicker of doubt crossed his hazel eyes, but then he smiled broadly and nodded at her. They worked their way back to the shore, kicked off their suits near the towels, and ran back towards the oncoming waves. Susan had never felt so much light and air on her skin. She dashed forward into chilly water. Once submerged to her chin, she felt totally buoyant, every pore in touch with the delicious sea water. She was awash in a world from which she'd evolved, and she did not want to ever swim back to shore again. But the sun was lower in the sky now, and the cliffs were in deep shadow. They returned to their towels, struggling to get back into their clammy suits. Climbing up the last flight of stairs, she was startled to look up to see a young family descending the stairs, the father carrying a small child in picnic basket, the mother behind, guiding a small child by the hand. The couple nodded pleasantly as they passed, and Susan thought how lucky they were to be out of the water by now. It had not occurred to her that other people might be using the beach. It was, after all, a private beach, and late in the day. Besides, "Who are they?" she asked. "Damned if I know," Bill said. "Friends of my family, I guess." Retracing their steps, they followed the grassy path and walked across the lawn to the waiting house. It's a very big place, Susan thought, and it seems to meander in many directions. Walking into the living room, they saw a man in an armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand. It must be Wally, up now after his siesta. Wally rose quickly but unsteadily, letting out a delighted sound, grasping Bill's hand. A short, wiry man, he fastened his gaze on Susan's face, appraising her with his half-closed eyes. He gave her a warm handshake, winked at her, and said, "Great to meet you, Susan. And for Bill's benefit, but watch out for this guy." He was wearing a dark blue beret. Was it to conceal baldness, or to strike the pose of an existentialist, she wondered. She excused herself after a few pleasantries, saying that she was dying to go upstairs and get into some dry clothes. Upstairs, she peeled off her suit and put on a denim skirt and embroidered blouse. She'd been advised by Bill not to bring anything dressy for the trip. He'd explained that this part of the island frowned on formal dress, very unlike the Down Island set that sported white shoes and linen every evening after 5. Susan heard a car motor and looked out of her window. Betty was exiting out of the driver's side of her car, and Alec, sporting a fisherman's hat, was getting out of the passenger side. They disappeared quickly around the front of the house. Susan heard them come into the living room below. Alec's voice was amazingly loud. "Wonderful! It was absolutely wonderful," he was proclaiming. "There's no place like the island for seeing these wild swans." He's a performer, she thought. She could hear Betty's laughter and muffled comments coming from Wally and Bill. Presently, Bill came upstairs and tapped on her door. He lifted the latch, looked in at her, and asked, "How are you doing?" "Oh, fine," she replied. "I just love the swim." He crossed the room with a long stride and pulled her to him. She tilted back her head, anticipating his warm kiss, and would have lost her balance altogether had he not steadied her. They sat on the edge of the bed, arms around each other, and she wished that they could stay in the peaceful little room uninterrupted for the rest of the day. Seconds later, there was a knock on the door, and Betty immediately stuck her head in. Scanning the scene in a flash, she smiled, saying, "I forgot to tell you we're all invited to the Coxes for dinner and drinks tonight. We'll leave by 5. Not waiting to gauge the effect, she ducked out, her footsteps heading rapidly down the stairs. Susan was now beginning to feel uneasy. Things were not turning out as she'd expected. She had hoped that Betty would turn out to be not so, she struggled for the right word, mobilized, like a moving fortress. There was something prickly about her and agitated. She had fantasized that she would be able to build rapport with Betty during the time that she was with her, perhaps talking about Aunt Maureen, convince Betty that she was a worthy enough person for Bill. Does the woman ever sit still, she wondered?